Chapter 6 of 8 Pillars of Prosperity by James Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 6, Fifth Pillar, Sympathy. The remaining pillars are the 4 central pillars in the Temple of Prosperity. They give it greater strength and stability, and add both to its beauty and utility. They contribute greatly to its attractiveness, for they belong to the highest moral sphere, and therefore to great beauty and nobility of character. They indeed make a man great, and place him among the comparatively few whose minds are rare, and that shine apart in sparkling purity and bright intelligence. Sympathy should not be confounded with that maudlin and superficial sentiment which, like a pretty flower without root, presently perishes and leaves behind neither seed nor fruit. To fall into hysterics about some suffering abroad is not sympathy, neither are bursts of violent indignation against the cruelties and injustices of others any indication of a sympathetic mind. If one is cruel at home, if he badgers his wife, or beats his children, or abuses his servants, or stabs his neighbors with shafts of bitter sarcasm, what hypocrisy is his profession of love for the suffering people who are outside the immediate range of his influence? What shallow sentiment informs his bursts of indignation against the injustice and hard-heartedness in the world around him? Says Emerson of such, "Go love thy infant, love thy wood-chopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off. Thy love afar is spite at home." The test of a man is in his immediate acts, not in ultra sentiments, and if those acts are consistently informed with selfishness and bitterness, if those at home hear his steps with dread and feel a joyful relief on his departure, how empty are his expressions of sympathy for the suffering or downtrodden, how futile his membership of a philanthropic society. Though the well of sympathy may feed the spring of tears, that spring more often draws its supply from the dark pool of selfishness, for when selfishness is thwarted, it spends itself in tears. Sympathy is a deep, silent, inexpressible tenderness, which is shown in a consistently self-forgetful, gentle character. Sympathetic people are not gushing and spasmodic, but are permanently self-restrained, firm, quiet, unassuming and gracious. Their undisturbed demur, where the suffering of others is concerned, is frequently mistaken for indifference by shallow minds, but the sympathetic and discerning eye recognizes, in their quiet strength and their swiftness to aid while others are weeping and wringing their hands, the deepest, soundest sympathy. Lack of sympathy is shown in cynicism, ill-natured sarcasm, bitter ridicule, taunting and mockery, and anger and condemnation, as well as in that morbid and false sentiment which is a theoretical and assumed sympathy, having no basis in practice. Lack of sympathy arises in egotism. Sympathy arises in love. Egotism is involved in ignorance. Love is allied to knowledge. It is common with men to imagine themselves as separate from their fellows, with separate aims and interests, and to regard themselves as right and others wrong in their respective ways. Sympathy lifts a man above this separate and self-centered life and enables him to live in the hearts of his fellows, and to think and feel with them. He puts himself in their place, and becomes, for the time being, as they are. As Whitman, the hospital hero, expresses it, "I do not ask the wounded person. It is a kind of impertinence to question a suffering creature. Suffering calls for aid and tenderness, not for curiosity, and the sympathetic man or woman feels the suffering, and ministers to its alleviation. Nor can sympathy boast, and wherever self-praise enters in, sympathy passes out. If one speaks of his many deeds of kindness, and complains of the ill treatment he has received in return, he has not done kindly deeds, but has yet to reach that self-forgetful modesty which is the sweetness of sympathy. Sympathy, in its real and profound sense, is oneness with others in their strivings and sufferings, so that the man of sympathy is a composite being. He is, as it were, a number of men, and he views a thing from a number of different sides, and not from one side only, and that his own particular side. He sees with other men's eyes, hears with their ears, thinks with their minds, and feels with their hearts. He is thus able to understand men who are vastly different from himself. The meaning of their lives is revealed to him, and he is united to them in the spirit of goodwill. Said Balzac, "The poor fascinate me. Their hunger is my hunger. I am with them in their homes. Their privations I suffer. I feel the beggar's rags upon my back. I for the time become the poor and despised man." It reminds us of the saying of one greater than Balzac, that a deed done for a suffering little one was done for him. And so it is. Sympathy leads us to the hearts of all men, so that we become spiritually united to them, and when they suffer we feel the pain, when they are glad we rejoice with them, when they are despised and persecuted we spiritually descend with them into the depths, and take into our hearts their humiliation and distress. And he who has this binding, uniting spirit of sympathy can never be cynical and condemnatory, can never pass thoughtless and cruel judgments upon his fellows, because in his tenderness of heart he is ever with them in their pain. But to have reached this ripened sympathy, it must be that one has loved much, suffered much, and sounded the dark depths of sorrow. It springs from acquaintance with the profoundest experiences, so that a man has had conceit, thoughtlessness, and selfishness burnt out of his heart. No man can have true sympathy who has not been, in some measure at least, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. But the sorrow and grief must have passed, must have ripened into a fixed kindness and habitual calm. To have suffered so much in a certain direction that suffering is finished, and only its particular wisdom remains, enables one, wherever that suffering presents itself, to understand and deal with it by pure sympathy. And when one has been perfected by suffering in many directions, he becomes a center of rest and healing for the sorrowing and broken-hearted who are afflicted with the afflictions which he has experienced and conquered. As a mother feels the anguish of her suffering child, so the man of sympathy feels the anguish of suffering men. Such is the highest and holiest sympathy, but a sympathy much less perfect is a great power for good in human life, and a measure of it everywhere and every day is needed. While rejoicing in the fact that in every walk of life there are truly sympathetic people, one also perceives that harshness, resentment, and cruelty that are all too common. These hard qualities bring their own sufferings, and there are those who fail in their business or particular work entirely because of the harshness of their disposition. A man who is fiery and resentful, or who is hard, cold, and calculating, with the springs of sympathy dried up within him, even though he be otherwise an able man, will, in the end, scarcely avoid disaster in his affairs. His heated folly in the one case, or cold cruelty in the other, will gradually isolate him from his fellows, and from those who are immediately related to him in his particular avocation, so that the elements of prosperity will be eliminated
8 Pillars
from his
of
life,
Prosperity.
leaving him with a
This is a
lonely failure,
LibriVox recording.
and perhaps a hopeless
All
despair.
LibriVox recordings are in the
Even
public
in ordinary
domain.
business
For
transactions,
more information
sympathy is an
or to
important
volunteer,
factor.
please
For people
visit
will always be attracted to those who are of a kindly and
LibriVox.org.
genial nature,
Recording
preferring
by
to deal
Andrea
with them
Fiore.
rather than with
8
those who are
Pillars
hard
of
and
Prosperity by James
forbidding. In all
Allen.
spheres where direct
Preface.
personal contact plays an important
It is
part,
popularly
the
supposed
sympathetic
that a
man
greater
of average
prosperity
ability
for individuals
will
or
always take
nations
precedence of the
can
man
only
of
come
greater
through
ability,
political and
but
social
who is
reconstruction.
unsympathetic.
This cannot be
If a
true
man be a
apart
minister,
from the
a
practice of
clergyman,
the moral virtues
a cruel
in the
laugh or an
individuals
unkind
that
sentence
comprise a
from him
nation
will seriously
Better
injure
laws
his
and social
reputation
conditions
influence.
will always follow
But
a higher
particularly his
realization of
influence,
morality among the
for even they who
individuals of a
admire his good
community.
qualities
But no
will,
legal
through
enactment
his
can give
unkindness,
prosperity to,
unconsciously have a
nay,
lower regard
it
for
cannot
him in their
prevent the
personal
ruin of,
esteem.
a man
If
or a
businessman
nation
professes
that has
religion,
become lax
people
and
will expect to
decadent
see
in the
good
pursuit and
influence of that
practice of
religion on
virtue.
his business
The
transactions.
moral virtues are the
To profess to
foundation
be a
and support
worshipper
of
of the gentle
prosperity,
Jesus on
as they are the
Sunday,
soul of
and all the
greatness.
rest of the week
They
be a
endure
hard, grasping
forever,
worshipper
and
of
all the
mammon,
works of a
will
man
injure
which
his
endure
trade
are built upon
and
them.
detract considerably
Without
from his
them,
prosperity.
there is neither strength,
Sympathy is a
stability,
universal spiritual
nor substantial
language,
reality,
which all,
but only
even the
ephemeral
animals,
dreams.
instinctively understand
To find
and
moral
appreciate. For all beings and creatures are subject to suffering, and this sameness of painful experience leads to that unity of feeling which we call sympathy. Selfishness impels men to protect themselves at the expense of others, but sympathy impels them to protect others by the sacrifice of self. And in this sacrifice of self there is no real and ultimate loss, for while the pleasures of selfishness are small and few, the blessings of sympathy are great and manifold. It can be asked, how can a businessman, whose object is to develop his own trade, practice self-sacrifice? Every man can practice self-sacrifice just where he is, and in the measure that he is capable of understanding it. If one contends that he cannot practice a virtue, for were his circumstances different, he would still have the same excuse. Diligence in business is not incompatible with self-sacrifice, for devotion to duty, even though that duty be trade, is not selfishness, but may be an unselfish devotion. I know a businessman who, when a competitor who had tried to cut him out of business cut himself out and failed, set that same competitor up in business again. Truly a beautiful act of self-sacrifice, and the man that did it is today one of the most successful and prosperous of businessmen. The most prosperous commercial traveler I have ever known was overflowing with exuberant kindness and geniality. He was as innocent of all tricks of trade as a newborn infant, but his great heart and manly uprightness won for him fast friends wherever he went. Men were glad to see him come into their office or shop or mill, and not alone for the good embracing influence he brought with him, but also because his business was sound and trustworthy. This man was successful through sheer sympathy, but sympathy so pure and free from policy that he himself would probably have denied that his success could be attributed to it. Sympathy can never hinder success. It is selfishness that blights and destroys. As goodwill increases, man's prosperity will increase. All interests are mutual, and stand or fall together, and as sympathy expands the heart, it extends the circle of influence, making blessings, both spiritual and material, to more greatly abound. Fourfold are the qualities which make up the great virtue of sympathy, namely, 1. Kindness, 2. Generosity, 3. Gentleness, 4. Insight. Kindness, when fully developed, is not a passing impulse but a permanent quality. An intermittent and unreliable impulse is not kindness, though it often goes under that name. There is no kindness in praise if it be followed by abuse. The love which seems to prompt the spontaneous kiss will be of little account if it be associated with a spontaneous spite. The gift which seems so gracious will lose its value should the giver afterwards wish its value in return. To have one's feelings aroused to do a kind action toward another by some external stimulus pleasing to oneself, and shortly afterwards to be swayed to the other extreme towards the same person by an external event unpleasing to oneself, should be regarded as weakness of character. It is also a selfish condition to be thinking of oneself only. A true kindness is unchangeable, and needs no external stimulus to force it into action. It is a well from which thirsty souls can always drink, and it never runs dry. Kindness, when it is a strong virtue, is bestowed not only on those who please us, but also upon those whose actions go contrary to our wish and will, and is a constant and never-varying glow of genial warmth. There are some actions of which men repent. Such are all unkind actions. There are other actions of which men
Preface
do not
of
repent.
8 Pillars of
Such
Prosperity.
are all kind actions.
This is a LibriVox
the
recording.
day comes when men are
All
sorry for
LibriVox
the cruel
recordings
things
are
they
in the
said
public
and did.
domain.
But the day of
For more
gladness is
information
always with them for
or
the
to
kindly
volunteer,
things they have said and
please
done.
visit
Unkindness mars a man's
LibriVox.org.
character. It mars his
Recording
face
by
as
Andrea
time goes
Fiore.
on, and it mars
8
that
Pillars of
perfection
Prosperity
success which
by
he would
James
otherwise
Allen.
reach.
Preface.
Kindness beautifies
It
the
is
character,
popularly
beautifies
supposed
the
that a
face
greater
with the growth of
prosperity for
years,
individuals or
and it
nations
enables a man
can
to
only
reach that
come through
perfection of
political and
success
social
to which his
reconstruction.
intellectual
This
abilities
cannot be
entitle
true
him.
apart from the practice
man's
of the moral
prosperity is
virtues
mellowed
in the
and
individuals that
enriched by the
comprise a
kindness of his
nation.
disposition.
Better laws and social
Generosity
conditions
goes with a larger
will always
hearted
follow a
kindness.
higher realization
If
of
kindness be the
morality
gentle
among the
sister,
individuals of a community.
generosity is
But
the
no
strong
legal
brother.
enactment can give prosperity
A free,
to,
open-handed, and
nay,
magnanimous
it cannot
character
prevent the
is
ruin
always
of,
attractive
a
and
man or a
influential.
nation that has become
Stinginess
lax
and
and
meanness always
decadent
repel.
in the pursuit
They are
and
dark,
practice of
cramped,
virtue.
narrow, and cold.
The moral virtues are the
Kindness and
foundation and
generosity
support
always
of
attract.
prosperity,
They are
as they are the
silent,
soul of
genial,
greatness.
open, and warm.
They endure
That
forever,
which repels
and
makes
all the
for
works of a
isolation
man
and
which
failure.
endure are built upon
That which
them.
attracts
Without
makes for
them,
union and
there is neither
success.
strength, stability,
Giving is as
nor
important
substantial
a duty as
reality,
getting.
but only
He who
ephemeral
gets all he
dreams.
can and
To
refuses
find moral
give,
principles,
will at last be unable to get, for it is as much a spiritual law that we cannot get unless we give, as that we cannot give unless we get. Giving has always been taught as a great and important duty by all religious teachers. This is because giving is one of the highways of personal growth and progress. It is a means by which we attain to greater and greater unselfishness, and by which we prevent the falling back into selfishness. It implies that we recognize our spiritual and social kinship with our fellow men, and are willing to part with a position of that which we have earned or possess, for a man who, the more he gets, hungers for more still, and refuses to loosen his grasp upon his accumulating store, like a wild beast with its prey, is retrogressing. He is shutting himself out from all the higher joy-giving qualities, and from free and life-giving communion with unselfish, happy human hearts. Dickinson's Scrooge in A Christmas Carol represents the condition of such a man with graphic vividness and dramatic force. Our public men in England today, probably also in America, are nearly all, I think I might say all, for I have not yet met an exception, great givers. These men, Lord Mayors, magistrates, town and city councillors, and all men fulfilling responsible public offices, being men who have been singularly successful in the management of their own private affairs, are considered the best men for the management of public affairs, and numerous noble institutions throughout the land are perpetual witnesses to the munificence of their gifts. Nor have I been able to find any substantial truth in accusation, so often hurled against such men by the envious and unsuccessful, that their riches are made unjustly. Without being perfect men, they are an honorable class of manly, vigorous, generous, and successful men, who have acquired riches and honor by sheer industry, ability, and uprightness. Let a man beware of greed, of meanness, of envy, of jealousy, of suspicion, for these things, if harbored, will rob him of all that is best in life, even all that is best in material things, as well as all that is best in character and happiness. Let him be liberal of heart and generous of hand, magnanimous and trusting, not only giving cheerfully and often of his substance, but allowing his friends and fellow men freedom of thought and action. Let him be thus, and honor, plenty, and prosperity will come knocking at the door for admittance as his friends and guests. Gentleness is akin to divinity. Perhaps no quality is so far removed from all that is coarse, brutal, and selfish as gentleness, so that when one is becoming gentle, he is becoming divine. It can only be acquired after much experience and through great self-discipline. It only becomes established in a man's heart when he has controlled and brought into subjection his animal voice, a distinct, firm, but quiet enunciation, and freedom from excitement, vehemence, or resentment in particularly aggravating circumstances. If there is one quality which, above all others, should distinguish the religious man, it is the quality of gentleness, for it is the hallmark of spiritual culture. The rudely aggressive man is an affront to cultivated minds and unselfish hearts. Our word gentleman has not altogether departed from its original meaning. It is still applied to one who is modest and self-restrained, who is considerate for the feelings and welfare of others. A gentle man, whose good behavior is prompted by thoughtfulness and kindliness, is always loved, whatever may be his origin. Quarrelsome people make a display in their bickering and recriminations of their ignorance and lack of culture. The man who has perfected himself in gentleness
Preface
never
of
quarrels,
8 Pillars of
never
Prosperity.
returns the hard word.
This is a
He
LibriVox
leaves it
recording.
alone,
All
or meets it with a
LibriVox
gentle
recordings
word,
are in the public
which is far
domain.
more powerful than
For more
wrath.
information or to
Gentleness is
volunteer,
wedded to wisdom,
please visit
and the wise man has overcome all anger in himself.
LibriVox.org.
And so
Recording by
understands how to
Andrea
overcome it
Fiore.
in others.
8 Pillars
The
of
gentleman is
Prosperity
saved from
by
most
James
of the
Allen.
disturbances and turmoil
Preface.
with which uncontrolled
It is
men afflict
popularly
themselves.
supposed that a greater
While they are wearing
prosperity for
themselves out with
individuals or
graceful and
nations
needless strain,
can only come through
he is
political
quiet
and
and
social
composed,
reconstruction.
and such quietness
This cannot
and
be true
composure
apart
are
from the
strong to
practice
win
of the
in
moral
battle of
virtues
life.
in the individuals that
Insight
comprise a
is the
nation.
gift of sympathy.
Better laws
The
and social
sympathetic mind is the
conditions
profound
will always
perceiving
follow a
mind.
higher realization
We
of
understand by
morality among the
experience
individuals
and
of
not
a
by
community.
argument.
But no
Before we can
legal
know a
enactment
thing or
can give
being,
prosperity
our
to,
life must touch
nay,
his or his
it cannot
life.
prevent the ruin of,
Argument
a man
analyzes
or
the
a
outer
nation
skin,
that has
but
become
sympathy
lax
reaches to
and
the
decadent
heart.
in the
The
pursuit
cynic
and practice
sees the
of
hat
virtue.
and coat and
The
thinks he
moral
sees
virtues
the man.
are the
The
foundation and
sympathetic
support of
seer sees the
prosperity,
man,
as they are
and
the
is not
soul of
concerned with the
greatness.
hat and coat.
They endure
In all
forever,
kinds of hatred,
and all the works of a
there is
man which endure
separation
are built
by
upon
which
them.
each misjudges
Without
the other.
them, there is neither
In all
strength,
kinds of love,
stability,
there is a
nor
mystic
substantial
union by which
reality,
each knows
but
the
only
other.
ephemeral dreams.
Sympathy, being
To
the
find
purest
moral
form
prin-
of this the greatest poet, because he has the largest heart. No other figure in all literature has shown such a profound knowledge of the human heart, and of nature both animate and inanimate. The personal Shakespeare is not to be found in his works. He is merged by sympathy into his characters. The wise man and the philosopher, the madman and the fool, the drunkard and the harlot, these he, for the time into their particular experiences, knew them better than they knew themselves. Shakespeare has no partiality, no prejudice. His sympathy embraces all, from the lowest to the highest. Prejudice is the great barrier to sympathy and knowledge. It is impossible to understand those against whom one harbors a prejudice. We only see men and things as they are when we divest our minds of partial judgments. We become seers as we become sympathizers. Sympathy has knowledge for her companion. Inseparable are the feeling heart and the seeing eye. The man of pity is the man of prophecy. He whose heart beats in tune with all hearts, to him the contents of all hearts are revealed. Nor are past and future any longer insoluble mysteries to the man of sympathy. His moral insight apprehends the perfect round of human life. Sympathetic insight lifts a man into the consciousness of freedom, gladness, and power. His spirit inhales joy as his lungs inhale air. There are no longer any fears of his fellow men of competition, hard times, enemies, and the like. These groveling illusions have disappeared, and there has opened up before his awakened vision a realm of greatness and grandeur. End of chapter 6. Recording by Andrea Fiore.
Hey there. Subscribe to my channel. And also press this bell icon.